Welcome back to the deep dive. Before we even get started, do me a massive favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the show right now.
It really is the absolute best way to support us.
Exactly. And make sure you never miss one of our deep dives. And today we have something completely different. It's highly provocative and incredibly dense.
Very dense. It requires a really careful approach.
Yeah, we are doing a special, ultra long and incisive deep dive reviewing a newly released 2026 ebook. It's called The Male Counter-Reformation Saving Western Civilization by Conrad Riker.
And right off the bat, we want to let you know that you can check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
You absolutely should. And you should follow the author at Conrad N. Riker on Substack to see his ongoing writings. That's at Conrad N. Riker.
Because it is certainly a text that is designed to leave an impression.
That is the understatement of the year. So here's the hook and the context you need before we wade into this material. This book is a hyper-detailed manifesto. It is written specifically for a men's rights activist audience, targeting what is often called the red-pilled manosphere demographic.
And the author claims to offer a master key.
Yes, a master key to understanding the entire history of Western institutions before they were, as he alleges, captured by feminists and Marxists.
It's highly structured and unapologetic.
Oh, completely unapologetic. He uses these highly sophisticated logical frameworks to make arguments that are deliberately designed to shock the mainstream. Our goal today is to unpack exactly how he constructs these arguments to captivate his readers.
But before we go a single step further, we need to issue a strict neutrality disclaimer.
Yes, please.
This is absolutely critical for you to understand as you listen to our analysis today. The book contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
It touches on extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing cultural flashpoints, though its ideology sits squarely in the far-right manosphere camp. We want to make it undeniably clear that we are not taking sides here.
Exactly. We are not adopting a red-pilled persona, and we are emphatically not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the sociological claims made in this content.
Our mission today is simply to act as your impartial expert guides. We are going to objectively report on the ideas, the historical examples, and the specific logical syllogisms contained within the original source material.
Think of us as structural engineers. We're examining a very controversial building.
Right. We are here to tell you how the beams connect, regardless of whether we agree with the building's purpose.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because where do we even begin with a text this expansive? It really does try to cover everything from evolutionary biology to cryptocurrency.
We're going to organize this deep dive sequentially to mirror the author's philosophical journey.
Makes sense.
First, we will look at his diagnosis of civilizational collapse. Second, his theory of how institutions were captured via cultural Marxism. Third, we will examine the biological bedrock he relies on to argue for immutable sex differences.
And fourth, we'll break down his economic theories of the gynocentric state.
Fifth, we will look at the specific rhetorical and psychological weaponry he equips his readers with.
Yeah.
And finally, his blueprint for this male counter-reformation and the creation of a parallel society.
So let's start with that diagnosis. Because Riker doesn't waste time with pleasantries or gentle introductions.
No, he jumps right in.
He opens the book with this blistering analogy about a certain Silicon Valley AI titan. He describes a company that used to organize the world's information flawlessly, but recently dedicated its vast engineering resources to policing microaggressions in internal chats.
He claims they prioritized safety and inclusion over speed and excellence.
Right, and the result of that shift. According to Riker, it was a glitchy product launch that, to quote the book directly, couldn't tell the difference between a biological woman and a kangaroo.
While their more ruthless competitors were literally launching rockets into orbit.
Exactly. He uses this as a microcosm for the whole civilization.
And it's a very deliberate rhetorical framing. Riker is arguing that this isn't just a corporate misstep or a bad quarter for a tech company, it's a civilizational symptom.
He's saying the West has systematically replaced the masculine mandate of competence with the feminine imperative of comfort.
But what makes his argument complex is that he doesn't just leave it as a cultural critique. He roots this immediately in evolutionary biology, specifically invoking the expensive tissue hypothesis.
Let's pause there because he leans heavily on that scientific concept. The expensive tissue hypothesis was proposed by paleoanthropologists, right?
Yes, he credits Aiello and Dean in the text.
Can you explain what that hypothesis actually is in mainstream science before we get into how Riker weaponizes it?
Certainly. In evolutionary anthropology, Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed this hypothesis in the 90s to solve a metabolic riddle.
Because the human brain is a massive energy drain.
Exactly, it's a metabolic glutton. It consumes about 20% of the body's resting energy, despite making up only roughly 2% of its mass. In biological terms, it's an incredibly expensive tissue to maintain.
So the hypothesis says that to afford that brain, we had to shrink another expensive tissue.
Right, and in our case, it was the gut.
Meaning we couldn't spend all our energy digesting tough plant matter anymore if we want to power this supercomputer in our skulls.
We needed high-quality, dense, easily digestible calories. And the evolutionary shift that provided those calories was the introduction of high-fat, high-protein animal tissue into the hominid diet. Meat.
Now, mainstream anthropologists debate the exact mechanisms, like whether it was scavenging or cooking.
But Riker zeroes in exclusively on the man-the-hunter paradigm.
Right. Riker asserts that this massive logic-driven organ expanded rapidly because of man the hunter. He calls this the evolutionary bedrock of our intellect.
He argues it is not a social construct, it is a metabolic fact.
And then he applies this ancient biological reality to the modern corporate world in a way that is just designed to really strike a nerve with his target audience.
Yes, the text posits that the modern workplace is essentially the evolutionary savanna relocated to a glass skyscraper.
He says the cognitive engine of civilization relies on the same traits that made the hunters successful.
Ruthless efficiency, a singular focus on the objective.
Extreme risk tolerance, and a complete disregard for social pleasantries when survival is on the line.
If you are listening to this right now and you've ever felt stifled by corporate bureaucracy, this is exactly the frustration Riker is trying to tap into.
He argues that by prioritizing HR departments focused on safety and inclusion, society has effectively removed the hunter from the equation.
He says we are starving the collective brain of the civilization.
He literally writes that we are trying to run a supercomputer on a gossip circuit.
That metaphor of the starved brain sets the stage for his views on the domestic sphere as well. He moves rapidly from the corporate skyscraper to the nuclear family.
Right. If the workplace is starving without the hunter, he argues the family unit is collapsing without the father.
He identifies what he calls the epidemic of fatherlessness as the catastrophic cost of ignoring biological reality.
And he brings some striking statistics to bear here to shock the reader. He cites data from the U.S. Department of Justice, claiming that a staggering 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions come from fatherless homes.
Now, sociologists often point to poverty systemic issues or a lack of community resources to explain those numbers.
But Riker doesn't view this as a mere correlation driven by economics. He views it as direct biological and psychological causation.
He tends to explain the why behind that statistic using a very rigid interpretation of behavioral psychology.
Right.
Riker argues that the single mother household, which he claims the modern matriarchy celebrates, actually functions as a primary manufacturing plant for pathology, criminality, and entitlement.
Walk me through that leap. How does he justify such an extreme condemnation of single mothers?
According to the manifesto's framework, a child fundamentally requires the disciplining logic of the father archetype to become a civilized adult.
The father, in Riker's view, represents external boundaries, emotional stoicism, and the concept of no.
He contrasts that with what he views as the maternal operating system, which he asserts is entirely based on emotional nurturing, immediate comfort, and safety.
So his argument is that a mother's natural instinct is to protect the child from stress, whereas the father's natural instinct is to expose the child to manageable stress so they grow stronger.
Precisely. Without the father to enforce the harsh rules of reality and delay gratification, Riker argues the child is rendered unfit for civilization.
He essentially says we are harvesting the behavioral thorns we sowed when society decided fathers were optional luxuries rather than structural necessities.
It's a bleak diagnosis. And he doesn't just look at modern crime stats. He pulls back to look at the entire arc of Western history to validate these anxieties.
Right, because if we connect this to the bigger picture, he leans heavily on classical history, specifically Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
He argues that Rome didn't just fall because external barbarians showed up at the gates with swords. The structural integrity of the empire crumbled internally first.
Because they stopped acting like Romans. He says they lost their masculine martial virtue and replaced it with bureaucratic decadence.
Yes. He specifically points to the Annona, the state grain dole.
Originally, the Roman Republic was built on the ethos of the citizen soldier, right?
The stoic farmer who would drop his plow to fight for the Republic and then return home.
But over centuries, as the empire grew wealthy, Riker notes that the populace abandoned this stoic duty.
They clustered in the cities demanding free bread, the Anona, and the violent distractions of the gladiatorial games.
Furthermore, they outsourced their defense to mercenary populations rather than fighting themselves.
And the modern parallel he draws here is incredibly aggressive. He says we are simply repeating the cycle.
He claims we are substituting the Colosseum for TikTok, meaning mindless, dopamine-driven entertainment.
And substituting the disciplined Roman legions for a bureaucratic police force that, in his words, cannot define a biological woman, but will arrest a citizen for mispronouncing a pronoun.
He is drawing a direct line between the loss of masculine physical hardship and the rise of frivolous state control.
He also uses the Weimar Republic in 1920s Germany as a more recent and much darker historical warning.
That's a heavy comparison. How does he frame the Weimar era?
Riker characterizes Weimar Germany as the quintessential experiment in hyper-feminized liberalism and hyper-emotionalism.
It was a period of immense cultural experimentation, sexual liberation, and avant-garde art.
But also crippling economic hyperinflation and political instability. He argues that this total rejection of traditional male stoicism and hierarchy created a chaotic void, a massive vacuum of power.
And as the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum.
So the inevitable result of that soft, chaotic culture was the violent authoritarian backlash of the Third Reich.
That is his assertion.
Yeah.
He frames authoritarianism not merely as a political shift, but as a violent, hyper-masculine correction to the chaos of a feminized society.
The pendulum swings too far one way, and it violently crashes back the other.
And he uses this to deliver a very dark warning to modern feminists and what he calls cultural Marxists.
He says they aren't creating the equitable utopia they think they are. They are engineering the exact conditions required for a brutal strongman to emerge.
His exact chilling phrase is that they are chopping wood for the guillotine they will eventually rest their own necks upon.
Okay, so that is his diagnosis. A civilization that has abandoned biological reality, starved its cognitive engine, and is teetering on the edge of a violent collapse.
Which brings us to part 2 of his argument. If the foundational institutions of the West, universities, corporations, the legal system, were originally built on this masculine logic, how did they get captured?
How did this alleged matriarchy take over?
Exactly.
Riker relies on the theory of cultural Marxism to explain this silent conquest. He argues it wasn't a violent revolution, it was an ideological subversion.
I hear the term cultural Marxism thrown around a lot in political discourse, often pretty vaguely, but Riker gets very specific about its origins.
He points directly to the Frankfurt School and a man named Antonio Gramsci.
For you listening who might not be familiar, who is Gramsci and why is he central to Riker's theory?
Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist intellectual and politician. He wrote extensively in his prison notebooks while incarcerated by Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in the 20s and 30s.
And Riker explains that Gramsci observed a fundamental problem for Marxist theory, right?
Yes. Traditional economic Marxism, the idea that the oppressed workers would inevitably rise up and seize the factories, had failed to materialize in the West.
Because the working class in the West, relatively speaking, was becoming more prosperous under capitalism. They didn't want a bloody revolution. They wanted a mortgage and a car.
Exactly. The economic revolution failed. Therefore, Gramsci theorized that the revolution had to change tactics.
He proposed what later became known as the Long March through the institutions.
Gramsci argued that capitalist power wasn't just held by force in the factories. It was held through cultural hegemony.
Meaning, the ruling class maintains control by dictating the culture, the values, and the norms.
You don't bomb the factories. You target what Gramsci called the superstructure.
The culture, the churches, the media, and most importantly, the educational system. You reprogram the operating system of the civilization from the inside out.
Precisely. Riker argues that intellectuals associated with the Frankfurt School thinkers like Herbert Marcuse and Max Horkheimer weaponized this concept through what they called critical theory.
Let's define critical theory within Riker's framework, because it sounds like it just means thinking critically.
Riker draws a sharp distinction. He describes critical thinking as aligning with classical Aristotelian logic, building up knowledge through rigorous testing.
But critical theory!
Critical theory, however, he defines as an intellectual pathogen, a virus. He claims its sole function is relentless negation.
It is designed to dismantle objective truth merit and traditional structures, and replace them with a narrative of perpetual subjective grievance.
So under critical theory, you don't ask, is this true? You ask, whose power does this truth serve?
Correct. And Riker goes so far as to call modern corporate HR departments the Soviet Politburo of this new cultural regime.
He says they have systematically swapped out merit, which he views as the immutable masculine standard of excellence, for equity.
He defines equity not as fairness, but as a subjective emotional whim used to mandate equal outcomes, thereby justifying mediocrity.
He claims they have castrated the competence hierarchies that keep the lights on and the planes flying.
Installing a system where the most ideologically possessed individuals rise to the top rather than the most competent engineers or thinkers.
And he sees the University Academy as ground zero for this war on logic. To illustrate just how far this capture has gone, he points to a highly publicized incident from 2017.
Right at Evergreen State College, involving an evolutionary biology professor named Brett Weinstein.
This is a fascinating incident to analyze.
For those who don't remember, Evergreen State College had a tradition called the Day of Absence, where minority students and faculty would voluntarily leave campus to highlight their contributions.
But in 2017, the organizers flipped the script. They asked white students and faculty to leave the campus.
Brett Weinstein, who considered himself a progressive, wrote an email refusing to participate. He stated that there's a huge difference between a group voluntarily absenting themselves and a group being forced off campus based on their race.
And the response to that email, as Riker details, was explosive. Weinstein was essentially hunted through the halls by a mob of enraged students.
The campus police chief told him she could not guarantee his physical safety, and the college president ordered the police to stand down.
Riker uses this specific event to show the terrifying endgame of critical theory.
Weinstein tried to use classical liberal principles, reason, and debate to argue his case with the mob, but Riker points out that you cannot negotiate with a theology of feelings.
Riker views the Evergreen incident as undeniable proof that lived experience has completely overthrown objective reality and the scientific method within the academy.
He cites Karl Popper, one of the most influential philosophers of science of the 20th century. Popper popularized the concept of falsifiability.
Let's break down falsifiability for the listener.
Falsifiability is the idea that for a claim or a theory to be considered truly scientific, there must be a way to prove it false.
For example, the statement, "all swans are white," is falsifiable because finding a single black swan disproves it.
Riker argues that the doctrines of modern gender studies, intersectionality, and critical race theory are entirely unfalsifiable.
Because if you disagree with the theory, your disagreement is cited as proof of your internalized bias, which only confirms the theory.
It's a closed loop. It's a rhetorical trap.
Exactly. Therefore, Riker argues these are not academic disciplines, they are religious dogmas. And he mourns the loss of what used to be the foundation of Western education, the trivium.
The trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. He says that used to be the holy trinity of masculine cognition.
You learn how to structure a sentence, how to structure a valid argument without fallacies, and how to persuade an audience.
He says this was designed to forge leaders and independent thinkers. Now he says we have replaced the trivium with social emotional learning, or SEL.
Riker claims that SEL is a deliberate mechanism to manufacture compliant, empathetic worker bees who are trained from kindergarten to apologize for their own existence.
And to prioritize group consensus over objective truth.
To really drive home what he believes has been lost, he contrasts this modern university safe space environment with the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660.
The Royal Society is a brilliant historical anchor for his argument. This was the birthplace of modern experimental science, featuring minds like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle.
Their motto was nullius in verba, which translates to take nobody's word for it.
Riker describes the Royal Society not as a polite collaborative networking event, but as an arena for intellectual masculine combat.
He says these natural philosophers gathered to violently tear each other's hypotheses apart.
They attacked the argument ruthlessly, not the man, just to see if the truth could survive the assault.
There was no concern for hurt feelings. If your theory couldn't withstand the intellectual battering, it was discarded.
He draws a direct, unbroken line from the loss of that rigorous, unapologetic intellectual combat to real-world physical disasters happening today.
He specifically points to the Boeing 737 MX crashes as the ultimate tragic manifestation of this cultural shift.
Now, this is a highly controversial leap. The mainstream consensus is that the Boeing crashes were the result of corporate greed, rushing a flawed software system called MCS to market to compete with Airbus and failing of trained pilots.
But Riker frames it entirely differently. He makes the provocative claim that those planes didn't fall out of the sky simply because of a mechanical demon.
He argues they fell because of a compliance demon.
He views the Boeing disaster as the inevitable result of an educational and corporate system that has spent decades prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics over the ruthless, mathematically unforgiving logic of engineering excellence.
He argues that when you promote managers based on their ability to navigate HR sensitivities, rather than their ability to violently interrogate a system's flaws like they did at the Royal Society system's fail.
Okay, so that covers his view of institutional capture. But to understand why he thinks this capture is fundamentally illegitimate, we have to move to part 3, the biology of immutable difference.
Right. Riker argues that the entire cultural takeover he describes is only possible because society has collectively agreed to swallow a massive foundational lie.
The idea that gender is merely a social construct.
Yes, he attacks the blank slate theory. The idea that humans are born without built-in mental content and that all behavior is written by culture and socialization.
He attacks us with everything he has, and he starts his counteroffensive at the absolute cellular baseline of existence, anosogamy.
Let's really dig into anosogamy because if you understand this, you understand the bedrock of his entire worldview. How does he take a microscopic cellular difference and use it to justify massive societal structures?
What's fascinating here is how he uses fundamental evolutionary biology to extrapolate everything else. Anosogamy is the biological reality of sexual reproduction involving two differently sized gametes.
That is the literal definition of biological sex.
You have the female gamete, the egg, which is a massive, stationary, and metabolically incredibly expensive for the body to produce.
A female mammal only produces a very limited number of these in her lifetime.
And on the other side, you have the male gamete, the sperm, which is microscopic, incredibly numerous, produced by the millions daily, and designed purely for fierce competition and delivery.
Riker argues that you fundamentally cannot build a fluid spectrum out of two distinct binary cellular components.
He claims that the moment anosogamy appeared in evolutionary history, you automatically, inevitably generated two immutable, divergent reproductive strategies.
Because the investment levels are so different.
Exactly. Drawing on evolutionary biologist Robert Triver's theory of parental investment, Riker notes that the female, because her egg is rare and gestation is physically taxing and dangerous, must adopt an investment strategy.
She must be highly selective about mating, seeking safety resources, and a strong provider to ensure the survival of her costly offspring.
Whereas the male, producing millions of cheap sperm, adopts a competition strategy.
His biological imperative is to secure as many mating opportunities as possible, which requires extreme risk-taking violence and status-seeking to outcompete other males.
Right. Riker says that claiming gender behavior as a social construct is a freshman logic error that denies millions of years of brutal evolutionary pressure stemming directly from those two cells.
To dismantle the social construct argument further, he doesn't just rely on theory. He brings in empirical studies to prove that behavior is baked in before birth.
He cites a 2014 study by Ruskanen and colleagues.
This is a crucial piece of his evidence. The Ruskanen study analyzed prenatal testosterone levels in amniotic fluid, meaning the hormones the fetus is exposed to while still inside the womb.
The researchers then tracked those children. The study found that these prenatal hormone levels definitively predicted male typical play behavior in childhood.
So Riker argues this proves that a young boy aggressively crashing a toy truck into a wall isn't the result of the patriarchy subtly socializing him.
It is a hormonal imperative operating before the child even took his first breath.
He also looks across species to primates, pointing out that male chimpanzees organically form aggressive, rigid dominance hierarchies and show a strong preference for object manipulation.
Female chimpanzees show a higher propensity for social grooming and infant care.
And they manage to exhibit these perfectly binary gender roles without ever reading a single piece of feminist literature or watching a television commercial. It's pure, unadulterated biology.
And perhaps his strongest empirical example is his discussion of CAH girls. CAH stands for congenital adrenal hyperplasia.
Yes. CAH is a genetic condition where female fetuses with XX chromosomes are exposed to unusually high levels of androgens, male sex hormones in the womb due to an enzyme deficiency.
Now, these individuals are born female, identified as female at birth, and socialized entirely as girls by their parents and society.
But Riker points out that despite this overwhelming feminine socialization, studies consistently show CAH girls heavily prefer male typical toys. They exhibit more aggressive play and later gravitate toward male-dominated careers.
He calls this a natural experiment that provides the ultimate proof of the power of hormones over socialization.
You can dress a CAH girl in pink, but her brain was bathed in testosterone and her behavior reflects the hormone, not the clothing.
Furthermore, he relies heavily on the extreme male brain theory posited by cognitive neuroscientist Simon Baron-Cohen, which Riker supports by citing various MRI meta-analyses.
This part of the book is super detailed. He breaks down the literal physical architecture of the brain.
He does. Riker points out that on average, the male brain has a significantly larger total volume. More importantly, it features higher intrahemispheric connectivity.
Meaning there are dense neural connections back and forth within individual hemispheres.
Baron-Cohen's theory suggests this specific wiring is optimized for systemizing. The drive to analyze, explore, and construct systems, whether that's a mechanical engine, a computer code, or a legal framework.
Conversely, the average female brain shows higher interhemispheric connectivity, meaning dense connections crossing back and forth between the left and right hemispheres.
Baron-Cohen argues this is optimized for empathizing, the drive to identify another person's emotions and thoughts and to respond with an appropriate emotion. It's built for rapid social navigation and consensus building.
Riker uses this neurological data to make a sweeping civilizational claim. He says that men are literally physically built to build systems and conquer harsh environments, while women are built to navigate complex social dynamics.
He insists this isn't a moral value judgment. One isn't better than the other. It is just a structural reality of the species.
But the way he applies it is certainly controversial. He argues that trying to force 50-50 equity in fields like STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math is a fool's errand.
Because STEM is pure systemizing.
He writes that trying to socially engineer equal outcomes in these fields is like trying to teach a goldfish to play chess. You are fighting against the fundamental neurological wiring of the organism.
But he argues this biological reality is currently under a coordinated attack, identifying what he calls a literal chemical war on boys.
He cites endocrinological data, specifically a well-known study documenting a steady population-wide drop in average male testosterone levels.
It's an alarming statistic. The study showed an approximate 1% per year drop in testosterone since the 1980s.
A 30-year-old man today has significantly less testosterone than his grandfather did at the exact same age.
Riker blames this partially on environmental factors. He points to endocrine disruptors, specifically synthetic xenoestrogens leaching into the water supply from plastics, agricultural chemicals like atrazine, and the widespread use of hormonal birth control.
But he pairs that environmental argument with a critique of psychological and chemical warfare in schools. He looks at the skyrocketing rates of ADHD medication amphetamines like Adderall and Ritalin prescribed overwhelmingly to young boys.
He claims that the modern educational system, which is a heavily female-dominated profession, is fundamentally incapable of managing the natural, hormonally driven kinetic energy of boys.
Rather than allowing them to run, wrestle, and compete, the system demands verbal compliance and the ability to sit perfectly still for 8 hours a day.
When boys naturally fail to conform to this feminine standard, Riker argues society doesn't change the classroom. It chemically lobotomizes the boy to force him to fit the mold.
Having established his absolute belief in biological determinism, Riker scales his argument up to the macro level in Part 4, the economics of civilization and the gynocentric state.
Here he aims to prove that men, despite being demonized by modern culture, are the indispensable economic engine keeping society from collapsing into the Dark Ages.
He starts this section with a concept he terms the male logistics paradox. He points out a glaring hypocrisy in mainstream feminist discourse.
He notes that activists constantly complain about the glass ceiling, the invisible barrier keeping women out of the comfortable air-conditioned corner offices and boardrooms.
But he argues they completely willfully ignore the glass cellar.
What exactly does he mean by the glass cellar?
By the glass cellar, he means the grimy, dangerous, physically grueling, and absolutely essential substratum of daily existence.
The high-voltage power grids, the subterranean sewage treatment facilities,
the deep-sea oil rigs, the long-haul trucking networks that deliver food to the cities. These are industries that are 95 to 99% male.
He notes that men constitute 93% of workplace fatalities.
He argues that men are quite literally the life support system for civilization. They are the ones taking on the massive physical risks and destroying their bodies in the process, driven by that evolutionary mandate to provide and conquer.
While women biologically avoid these fatal risks.
He uses a very evocative historical contrast here to make his point. He compares men like Leland Stanford and the thousands of nameless laborers who blasted through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains to build the Transcontinental Railroad.
They faced avalanches, explosives, and death to connect a continent.
And he compares those builders to the modern corporate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion officer.
He says the DEI officer's greatest feat of engineering is constructing a theoretical safe space in a boardroom.
He argues their primary output is just generating friction in email chains and punishing the people actually doing the work.
One archetype built the engine of modern prosperity. The other is a parasitic tax on it.
This concept of parasitism is central to his most crucial and likely most offensive to mainstream sensibilities economic argument. He formalizes this as the syllogism of servitude.
And he doesn't base this on philosophy. He roots it in hard fiscal data from the IRS and the OECD.
Okay, let's really break down the syllogism step by step, because Riker presents this as mathematical certainty, not a conspiracy theory. Walk us through the math.
He lays it out like this. When you look at tax data over the entire lifespan of a demographic group, the data demonstrates that men in the aggregate are the only net positive lifetime contributors to the state.
Meaning they pay more in income tax, property tax, and capital gains over their lives than they consume in government services.
Okay, that's premise one. What's premise two?
Premise two is that women as an aggregate demographic are net beneficiaries of state spending.
Due to lower average lifetime earnings, career breaks for child rearing, and longer lifespans, they consume significantly more in healthcare, public education, subsidized housing, and welfare programs than they will ever contribute in taxes.
Therefore, his conclusion, the syllogism of servitude, is that the modern welfare state is mechanically, mathematically, a massive transfer of wealth from the male host to the female consumer.
Exactly. He says the government has essentially replaced the traditional husband. The state acts as the ultimate beta provider.
It uses the threat of force to confiscate male labor and capital through taxes and redistributes it to subsidize the lifestyles of women.
Because the state provides this financial safety net, women no longer have to rely on a traditional marriage to survive.
And he claims this economic shift completely short-circuits evolutionary biology. This is where he introduces the Pareto principle of female hypergamy. Let's explain the Pareto principle first.
The Pareto principle, often called the 80-20 rule, is an economic observation originally made by Vilfredo Pareto, who noted that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population.
It's a power law distribution that appears everywhere. 80% of a company's sales come from 20% of its clients. 80% of a software's crashes are caused by 20% of the bugs.
Right. And Riker takes this cold economic principle and maps it directly onto human mating behavior using data released by the dating app Tinder.
He points to studies of Tinder swipe data showing a brutal asymmetry. Women on the app found 80% of men to be below average in attractiveness.
The data showed that the top 10 to 20% of men were receiving roughly 80% of the female attention and matches.
He argues that historically female hypergamy, the biological drive to mate with the highest status male possible, was kept in check by the harsh reality of survival.
A woman had to eventually settle for a reliable average provider male, the 80%, just to ensure she and her children didn't starve.
But today, because the state funded by the taxes of those average men now provides that baseline security through welfare food stamps and public housing, women are entirely freed from the necessity of settling.
Riker argues they are free to endlessly chase the top-tier genetically gifted alpha males for transient thrills.
He claims this specific dynamic, the state subsidizing female hypergamy, is what is creating the massive socially destabilizing demographic of incels, which he attempts to rebrand as voluntary abstinence.
Men who realize the game is rigged and opt out. It also explains the explosion of single motherhood as women share the top men who have no intention of sticking around.
Riker sees the entire legal system, particularly family courts, as the violent enforcement arm of this wealth extraction. He views the institution of no-fault divorce as the final nail in the coffin of the nuclear family.
No-fault divorce was pioneered in California in the late 1960s, allowing marriages to be dissolved without having to prove infidelity or abuse, just irreconcilable differences.
Riker notes that today divorce is initiated 70 to 80% of the time by women.
He references the pessimistic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer here, suggesting that the modern legal system is a weaponized tool to facilitate the transfer of assets from the producer to the consumer.
He says family courts do not dispense justice, they dispense plunder.
He specifically attacks the legal standard known as the best interest of the child. Family court judges use this standard to determine custody and child support.
But Riker argues this phrase is nothing more than a rhetorical euphemism. He claims it is a smokescreen used by judges to strip men of their hard-earned assets, evict them from their homes, and alienate them from their children.
He argues this system effectively gilds the male drive to innovate and build empires, because what rational man would build an empire knowing the state can arbitrarily seize half of it on a whim?
Which brings us to part 5 of the book, Rhetorical Weaponry and Psychological Awakening.
Riker knows his diagnosis of the world is incredibly bleak, so he dedicates a significant portion of the book to training his readers how to fight back.
He doesn't advocate for physical violence. He advocates for rhetorical dominance, specifically using classical logic against modern cultural arguments.
He says you have to master the trivium again. You have to treat every conversation, every corporate meeting, every date like an intellectual shit test.
And he provides his readers with a specific, actionable, logical fallacy checklist to use to dismantle feminist arguments in real time.
Let's examine how he coaches them. First, he targets the ad hominem fallacy, attacking the person instead of the argument.
When a feminist argues that a man's point is invalid because it stems from toxic masculinity or dismisses him for mansplaining, Riker instructs his readers to instantly categorize this as an ad hominem attack.
He tells men to completely reframe the insult. When they say toxic, he tells his readers to define toxic as poisonous to the parasite.
He coaches them to respond by claiming that masculine logic is the cure to a sick society, not the disease.
Then he tackles begging the question, or circular logic. He says the whole concept of the patriarchy as taught in universities is an unfalsifiable tautology of blame.
The logic generally goes the patriarchy exists because men dominate all the top positions and men dominate all the top positions because of the patriarchy.
It's a loop. He coaches men to break this loop by introducing biological variables.
He tells them to argue that men dominate the extreme ends of society, both the corner offices and the prisons, because male biology has a wider standard deviation.
High-end positions require extreme risk tolerance, hyper-competitiveness, and a willingness to sacrifice work-life balance, which are biologically male traits amplified by testosterone, not a systemic conspiracy to keep women down.
He also equips them against the false dichotomy, the trap of being told either you're a feminist or you're a misogynist who hates women.
Riker tells his readers to shatter this binary trap by confidently claiming a third option.
He advocates for supporting classical liberal rights for women like property rights and voting, while simultaneously rejecting the victimhood hierarchy of modern feminism and fiercely defending masculine sovereignty.
And one of the more aggressive rhetorical traps he tries to dismantle is the no true Scotsman fallacy.
Whenever a progressive policy fails or causes societal harm, the defense is always, well, that wasn't real communism or that wasn't real feminism.
Riker says you have to bind the ideological movement to its real-world consequences. When they tout liberation, force them to own the debris.
Force them to own the outcomes of no-fault divorce, the fatherlessness epidemic, and the skyrocketing suicide rates among men who've been stripped of purpose.
But Riker understands that intellectual arguments and logical checklists aren't enough if the man's underlying psychology is broken. He believes modern men are physically and spiritually sick.
This is where he introduces his most intense protocol, hormonal stoicism.
This protocol is wild. He literally connects the act of arguing against feminists to physically boosting your testosterone.
How does he justify that connection?
He diagnoses the average modern man as suffering from a hypogonadal fog. Hypogonadism is the medical term for low testosterone.
Riker argues this fog is induced by a combination of societal shaming, being told masculinity is toxic, and a chemical dopamine addiction to screens, porn, and junk food.
To break out of this, he proposes a brutal physical and mental regimen, 30 days of strict isolation fasting and extreme cold exposure.
He says this intense physical shock to the system remyelinates neural pathways, but the cognitive aspect is the core of his thesis.
He claims that engaging in rhetorical combat, actively dissecting logical fallacies, and decisively winning arguments against what he calls the gynocentric system actually engages the problem-solving, systemizing areas of the male brain.
He cites studies showing that male testosterone levels fluctuate based on victory and defeat. When a man's sports team wins, his testosterone spikes.
Riker argues that by winning intellectual battles, the man shifts his biology from a subordinate high cortisol stress state to a dominant high testosterone winning state.
He elevates this entire concept of the psychological shit test to a massive civilizational scale.
We should define that term for the listener. In the evolutionary psychology and pickup artist communities, a shit test is a subconscious maneuver a woman uses to test a man's fitness.
She might create unnecessary drama, make an unreasonable demand, or insult him to test his frame.
If he apologizes, gets emotional, or capitulates to please her, he fails the test and loses her respect. If he remains stoic and holds his ground, he passes.
Riker claims that modern wokeness, cultural Marxism, DEI initiatives, all of it is just a collective civilizational shit test emanating from the female consciousness.
It is a biological stress test to see if Western men still have a spine.
And he says men are failing it spectacularly by constantly apologizing for their historical privilege, taking a knee, and policing their own speech.
He warns that projecting this therapeutic empathetic apologies, first worldview onto the geopolitical stage is suicidal.
He points out that adversarial patriarchal nations like Russia, China, and Iran are not interested in therapy, historical guilt, or microaggressions.
He argues they view Western empathy and emotional posturing not as a sign of moral superiority, but as a profound fatal weakness meant to be exploited.
They will not negotiate with the West's feelings. They will simply punch the civilization in the face.
Which leads us directly to the final section of the book, Part 6. The counterstructure, Riker's ultimate solution.
Because he believes the current institutions, universities, courts, corporations, the military are terminally infected with this emotional virus, he says they cannot be reformed from within.
You cannot vote your way out of biological collapse.
His solution is what he calls the Great Refusal, or the monastery option. He compares this exact cultural moment to Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door.
Luther realized the Catholic Church was too corrupt to fix from the inside, so he bypassed it entirely using new technology, the printing press.
Riker advocates for men going Galt, a direct reference to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
Meaning competent high IQ men must collectively withdraw their cognitive labor, their engineering skills, their taxes, and their participation from the gynocentric system.
Starve the beast. Let the rotting, top-heavy edifice collapse under its own bureaucratic weight.
And while the mainstream system collapses, he urges men to build a parallel society, what he ambitiously calls the Manosphere Jerusalem.
And the foundation of this new society isn't political ideology, it's decentralized technology, it's the blockchain.
He views fiat currency dollars, pounds, euros as emotional money. He argues it is printed based on the empathy of central planners.
When the populace complains of economic pain, the government simply prints more money to fund welfare and bailouts.
But printing money creates inflation, and Riker views inflation as a stealth tax on the productive mail saver to perpetually fund the welfare state for the consumer.
But Bitcoin, he argues, changes the paradigm completely. He calls Bitcoin the ultimate digital embodiment of masculine meritocracy and natural law.
Because it relies on cryptographic proof of work, it is mathematical, immutable, and completely immune to what he calls gynocentric gaslighting.
I love how he phrases that. You can't cry to a blockchain. You can't file an HR complaint against a SHA-256 hash function to get it to lower its standards. It enforces objective reality. It forces society back to a hard standard of merit.
He also sees the rapidly approaching technological singularity and artificial intelligence as a uniquely male renaissance.
Oh, this is where his predictions get truly sci-fi. He says large language models and AI systems are essentially massive syllogism machines.
They operate on pure binary logic, probability, and code. They don't have feelings. They don't care about your lived experience, your trauma, or your corporate diversity scorecard.
Riker predicts that AI will fundamentally destroy the feminist power base in the corporate world.
He argues that the bloated HR departments, the DEI consultants, and the massive administrative middle management class, which he characterizes as female-dominated spheres of emotional labor and compliance monitoring, will be entirely automated out of existence.
And AI can monitor compliance instantly without needing a salary. The economy, he claims, will aggressively shift back to valuing pure logic coding and systems engineering traits he firmly links to the extreme male brain.
And he takes this concept of automation to the absolute biological extreme. He talks about sperm warfare and introduces the concept of Galatea.
He references the Greek myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who created a statue so beautiful and perfect Galatea that he fell in love with it and the gods brought it to life.
Riker uses this to discuss the rise of AI companions like Replica or Character.ai, but extrapolated 10 years into the future.
He argues that young men are already abandoning the modern dating market en masse because the risk-to-reward ratio is broken.
The financial cost of biological female attention is too high. The risk of false accusations is too great, and the quality of companionship is too low.
These advanced AI companions offer men validation, peace, and absolute loyalty without the risk of being destroyed in divorce court.
Combine the perfection of the psychological AI companion with the coming reality of artificial wombs and advanced IVF technology.
Riker predicts that within a few decades, the biological female monopoly on reproduction and companionship will be completely broken.
Men will be able to replicate their genetics and fulfill their emotional needs without needing to interact with modern women at all, effectively crashing the market value of biological female attention to zero.
So the final blueprint he leaves his readers with is a plan for total structural exit. He advocates for men forming exclusive guilds and mastermind groups.
He calls for the use of private arbitration tribunals built on smart contracts to settle disputes entirely outside the jurisdiction of state family courts.
He points to the explosive growth of independent, male-centric podcasting and media, valuing it at over $15 billion, as proof that this counter-economy is not just theoretical, it is already thriving and highly profitable.
And his ultimate political goal for this new Jerusalem, a society where the right to vote is no longer a universal right based on mere existence, but is strictly tied to your net tax contribution.
Only the producers, the people with actual financial skin in the game who keep the engine running, get a say in how the surplus is used.
It is an incredibly detailed, ruthless vision of the future.
It really is.
This raises an important question, and as final thought, I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over as we conclude our analysis of Riker's manifesto. Riker places all his faith in decentralized technology and AI as the ultimate saviors of masculine logic.
He believes the machine will always inherently favor objective, proof of work, and cold calculation.
But we have to consider the alternative trajectory of AI development. What if artificial intelligence, which is increasingly being designed by tech giants to perfectly mimic human empathy, emotional intelligence, and complex social connection, actually masters the feminine domain better than humans do?
Wow.
Could AI end up automating not just masculine systems logic, but also feminine emotional labor? If a machine can provide perfect frictionless empathy, it could create a bizarre post-gender reality that completely escapes and renders obsolete the strict binary biological determinism that Riker's entire worldview is built upon.
That is a wild thought to end on. If the machine can fake empathy perfectly, the whole binary that he relies on completely collapses.
Indeed, it challenges the very foundation of his technological utopia. It suggests the singularity might not be a male renaissance, but the end of gendered utility altogether.
As a reminder to you listening, our goal today was to dive deep into the highly charged, incredibly provocative, and highly structured arguments presented in this book. We know this material is intense.
We are here strictly to help you understand the architecture of this specific subculture and worldview, maintaining our role as your impartial guides through the text.
We have objectively laid out the author's syllogisms, his historical interpretations, and his sociological claims exactly as they exist in the manifesto without endorsement.
If you want to read the source material for yourself and examine the arguments firsthand, make sure to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book The Male Counter-Reformation by Conrad Riker.
And you can follow the author directly at Conrad and Riker on Substack to see more of his ongoing work. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive, complex journey today. Please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these ultra-long deep dives into the most fascinating, challenging, and controversial material out there. See you next time.